How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 52, Daf Nun Beis, Daf 52 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, who could tell me what Daf 52 talks about? Well, the Maisa Daf 52, I'd say there are some interesting parts. Let's say that. I'd say there are some interesting parts. The Maisa, it's all good. Some parts are particularly somewhat interesting. I'd say. So we continue discussing our Mishnah about different ways of doing chalitza and get and all sorts of stuff. But there's some interesting stuff in there. Alright friends, we're going to start, essentially at the top of Nun Beis and Aleph, but all the way at the bottom of Nun Aleph and Beis. Ketzad also Maimer Chule, and now we're already on, Nun Aleph and Beis, that was Darin, and now we're already on Nun Beis and Aleph. Etc. So the Mishnah had said, who could remind me what the Mishnah had said? Well, the Mishnah had started talking off. What? Started off talking. It had said, Rabbi Gamliel Omer, right? Remember that? There's machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and the Chacham. Is there get after a get? There's the mimer after a mimer, and then the Mishnah says, Ketzad, how is this? Also Maimer v'chule. So, Frekti Gemara, hay gerach or geru? I don't understand. The Mishnah is talking about gerach or get, and then we say, how is this? Ketzad. Also Maimer b'yivimto v'noson get. He did Maimer and gave a get. What does Maimer and get have to do with gerach or get? So that's the Gemara's kasha. You got it? Good. So, hay gerach or geru? Is this gerach or get? Amar v'Yehuda, hachika amar. It says of Yura that this is how to understand the Mishnah. Gerach or get, u'maimer achar maimer, kedamorin. Look, get after get and maimer after maimer. We already discussed it in earlier in the Gemara, and that's how to understand gerach or get and maimer achar maimer, right? We discussed it, right? Either with Shimon with Sarah and Rivka, or Shimon and Levi with Sarah, whatever it is, friends. We've done that already. Now, now, if we look at a situation where there's one Yavam and one Yevama, right? For example, Reuven is married to Sarah, Reuven dies, Shimon and Sarah now, have to figure it out. So, how does this work out? Ketzad mitzvah satar ason. How can you sort of deal with this situation? So, also Maimer b'yivimto v'noson lo get. So, in the event where Shimon does Maimer with Sarah, he gives her Kesef Kedushin, which on this daf we're going to learn about what exactly Maimer is, which is very interesting because we've been talking about Maimer for, almost as far as we can remember in Masechta Yevamos. And now on this daf, on daf 52, on daf Nun Beis, we're actually the Gemara is going to explain how do you do Maimer, which is Givaldic. So now, if this fellow does Maimer V'noson laget. So he gives her Kesef Kiddushin, right? He says, now it's on the page, we can even look, although it's not on the page, Rashi has to say it. He says, it's Kad Sheli b'Maimer Yevomin. He gives her money, and he says, be betrothed to me, or whatever, however you define Mikudeshes, through Maimer Yevomin. Now, so if he does Maimer, Bivim to V'noson laget, and then he gives her a get, which basically cancels out the mimer. You still have to do chalitza, etc., right? Meaning the Mishnah is now moving on to explaining different things that can happen between Shimon and Sarah. Also, mimer uvo'al harizok mitzvaso. The Mishnah had said, that also mimer, that if Shimon does Maimer with Sarah, Uval, and then he does Yibum, Harizuk Mitzvah. That's the proper way to do Yibum, right? As we're going to see also right now, basically, right? That Ramamish going to see right now, well, in a few minutes, that, you don't just, do Bia. Even by Kiddushin, we're going to see, right? We're not just Mekadesh Bia. We don't just, do Yibum straight away. Rather, we first go through a betrothal process, and so the Mishnah is saying that if Shimon first is Mekadesh Sarah, and then he does bia, he and Sarah have bia, and they do yibum, so that's yibum. That's the proper way to do yibum. Fine. So it sounds like this is what's a boon? A boon is like a good thing, right? Whatever it is. Let's say this is a good thing for Rav Huna. The Rav Huna says, mitzvah yivamo. So how do you do yibum? Well, mikadesh. First you do mimer. V'achakach boil. And then afterwards you do yibum. So you don't go straight to yibum. You don't go straight to bia first. You do mimer. You do kiddushin. We're going to see soon that you could do it with a shtar. Ema avzik mitzvasa. So the Gemara says, well, it's not necessarily a proof for Rav Huna, because you could say afzik mitzvasa, that this also works. Like, you could theoretically argue that, you could just go straight to bia, but you could also do mimer first. So it's not necessarily an outright support for Rav Huna, because it's not outright saying necessarily that you're supposed to do mimer first. Pshita, it's obvious that that this would also work. So Sakadat Techemina, I may have thought that maybe it doesn't also work to do mimer first, because Kevin the Amar Mar, since we said also mimer bivim to parche menu zikas ivomen v'cholol of zikas erisim v'nisuin, that since we say that Shimon, if he does mimer with Sarah, so parcha, I'm reading that again, parche menu zikas ivomen, so the zika goes away, v'cholol of zikas erisim v'nisuin, and now it's like he's in a status of erisin v'nisuin. Right, that so therefore, right, so we're saying that if Shimon does mimer with Sarah, so then the zika that they had between them goes away, and now they're like engaged, and when they get married, it's like they're getting married, and therefore ema lav mitzvah ka'avid. So I might think that at that point when they do yibum, he's not doing yibum anymore, the zika is gone. So kamash malon, that no, if he does mimer first, so that's fine. Mimer is like a step towards yibum, and it's completely fine. Mimer doesn't cancel out the zika to the extent that he can no longer do yibum. No, you do mimer, you do yibum after that. Gufa. So we had just said that according to Rav Huna, the mitzvah of yibum is first you do mimer, and then you do bia, and that is yibum. The involve also mimer kono. And if he first did bia, if he first did yibum, and then after he did yibum, he did mimer, kana, it's fine, it works. Involve also mimer pshita, the kanya bebia. I don't understand. Obviously, if he first did bia, if he first did yibum, and then afterwards, for whatever reason, he says, hey, right, mikudeshesli, after they already did yibum, I mean, of course it'll be fine. I mean, they already did yibum, they're already married. Ela, emo imba below mimer. No, what we're saying is that if he went straight to yibum, he went straight to bia, he didn't first do mimer, kana, it nonetheless works. Vatanya loke, but we learn in a brisa that Itaka gets lashes, malchus, which means, therefore, that if you go straight to yibum, if we give you lashes, then that implies that it's also midoraisa, right? We give lashes for things that are also midoraisa. And therefore, if it's also midoraisa, then how could we say that if you go straight to yibum it works? It's also midoraisa. So we're saying midorabonon. We give malchus. We're not saying that you give malchus because you violated a deoraisa by going straight to yibum. Rather, you violate a derabonon, and therefore we'll give makas mardus. Makas mardus is derabonon makas, just to beat you up a shtickle. Derabmangid man the mekadesh bibia, that Rav would apply, would whip. Rav would whip a fellow who would be mekadesh with bia. You would get whipped. Because we don't want you to be mekadesh with bia, we want you to be mekadesh, I guess, bekesed, bishtar, uman the mekadesh bishuka, or a fellow who betroths a woman in the market. I guess it's not really I guess we don't want you betrothing women in the market. Alright? Uman the mekadesh below shaduchi, or somebody who is mekadesh a woman without an agreement in advance, right? It sounds like these are kind of, we want you to take getting married seriously. We don't want you to just get married in Shuk Machne Yehuda or without any prior arrangement, or just to get married with bia, or if you have like a fellow who's sending a get to his wife to get divorced, and he sends it with a messenger, and then he catches up with the messenger in advance and says, no, this get is not a valid get. I rescind the get. So don't do that, because it can lead to issues, where he gives it anyways, or it could be a mess. Or if a fellow who's writing a get and he sort of starts saying that, he doesn't want to give it, he's not into it, he's not interested, so then Rav would lash him. Or if the Bezdin sends to go collect a fellow to come to Bezdin, or to tell a fellow that he needs to come to Bezdin, and he mistreats these representatives of the court. Or if you have a fellow who has been excommunicated, and for 30 days he doesn't even come to court to try to dispute it, to try to, get out, to try to fix the situation, or, he just doesn't seem to care. That the excommunication just doesn't even affect him whatsoever. He doesn't even come to Bezdin to try to follow up. So then Rav would whip him. And if a son-in-law who lives in his in-law's house, because we're concerned that maybe there might be some inappropriate relationships happening between the son-in-law and the mother-in-law. The dair in the chalif lo, what, only if they live in the same house it's a problem, but just passing by the house would be okay. But there was a certain fellow who would just pass by his mother-in-law's house, and Rav Sheshes whipped him. Well, in that particular case, there was actually suspicion. There was actually reason to be concerned that maybe there was an inappropriate relationship happening between this son-in-law and this mother-in-law. And that's why he got whipped, even just for passing by. Says Nardai, actually, the only case out of all these listed, the only case where Rav would whip a fellow was if he betrothed a woman without a prior agreement. I mean, he just, bibia, if he betrothed a woman with intercourse without a proper agreement in advance, it makes it seem like it was very rushed and not particularly appropriate. And to those who say that even if there is, that even if there was an agreement in advance, still we don't want a fellow being mekadesh bibia. It's not mishum pritzusa. It's not a very I don't know. Be mekadesh with a ring. I guess it's more. I don't know what's pritzusa, because more appropriate. It's riskier to just say I'm going to be mekadesh with bia, rather be mekadesh, sort of with a shtar, with kesef, and then fine. Taner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Kate said Maimer. Oh, how does Maimer work? We've been talking about Maimer for a long time, right? It's this like Rabbanon Kiddushin in the context of Yibum. So let's see. Taner Rabbanan, Kate said Maimer. How does Maimer work? Noson la kesef, o shvei kesef. So if Shimon gives Sarah money, or the equivalent of money, let's say a ring, uvishtar ketzad, and how can you do Maimer with a document? What do you mean bishtar ketzad? How do you do it with a document? Kidamor, the same way that you do kiddushin with a document. Kosov la laniyar or lacheres. If he writes to her on a piece of paper or on a piece of pottery, right? So in the context of kiddushin, it would be ariyat mekudeshesli. Afal pi she'ein bo shavet pruta ariyat mekudeshesli. Right? Even though the shard of pottery or the paper isn't worth a pruta, isn't worth a certain amount of money, nonetheless, it doesn't matter. He writes, you are betrothed to me, and that works. That's how you're mekadesh. That's how a man would betroth a woman with a document. So what's the deal? How come we're asking how to do it with Maimer? Isn't it going to be the same thing? Omar Baye Ochiko Omar, says Abaye, this is what it means. Shtar ksubas yivomin ketzad. It's something completely different. We're not talking about Maimer anymore. We're talking about what is the marriage document for in the context of Yibum look like, a ksuba, right? Everybody knows a ksuba, right? The marriage document that they read under the chuppah. So what does that look like in the context of Yibum? So the answer is, kosav law, he writes to her, Ona Ploni bar Ploni, I, so-and-so, the son of so-and-so, Kabilisias Plonis Yevamti, Olai, I accept, so-and-so, my Yevama upon me, Lozun Lefanusa Karoi, that I will support her properly, Vavajte Ksubasa Anichse Baila Rishon, but the Ksuba will be based on Reuven, the original husband, right? So if Shimon dies, so then she collects her Ksuba from Reuven's estate, not from Shimon's estate. But if Reuven doesn't have any estate to pay her from, Takinu Rabbanon Misheni. So then Shimon needs to pay for the Ksuba, so that it shouldn't be too simple to let her go, right? Right. We want there to be some kind of financial implication of getting divorced, so that if Reuben doesn't have anything to pay Sarah from, and Shimon doesn't have to pay Sarah, he can just easily divorce her, and there's no really ramification. So we say, look, if Reuben doesn't have any assets to pay Sarah for the marriage contract, if they get divorced or whatever, so then Shimon needs to provide that, so that he would think twice before simply desiring a divorce. Okay, so Abai taka asks a kasha from Rabba. What does he ask? He asks, Nosun lo get v'omar. If Reuven dies, right? Now Shimon and Sarah need to do something, right? Yibum, chalitza. So we've been talking about a get in the context of Yibum. So what if he gives her a get? So Ba'mine Abai mirabba. Abai asks Rabba, Nosun lo get v'omar. If Shimon gives a bill of divorce to Sarah, and he says, Hareh migoresha seimeni, you are divorced from me, okay? V'iyat muteres l'chol adam, but you're not permitted to anybody else. You hear that? You're divorced from me, but you're not permitted to anybody else. So now, Ma'u, what's the halacha in the context of Yibum? Kabi Yevamo derabonanu. So get Yevamo derabonanu. So the get of a Yevamo is derabonon, right? Midoraisa, it's irrelevant. Midoraisa, it's only Yibum or Chalitza. The fact that a get has any nafkaminis in the context of Yibum is derabonon. Now, get the mahani be'eshes ish mahani be'Yevamo. Do we say that only a get, which works in the context of a regular marriage, works in the context of Yibum? Get the lo mahani be'eshes ish lo mahani be'Yibum be'Yevamo. But a get that would not work in the context of a regular marriage would not work in the context of Yibum, and therefore, in the context of a regular marriage, right, a get needs to permit this woman to marry anybody else, right? Meaning, a man and a woman are married, so obvious, in the she cannot marry anybody else if she's married to him. So now, when they get divorced and the husband gives this bill of divorce to his wife, now she can marry whoever she wants. So, but if he says to her, you're divorced from me, but you're not allowed to marry anybody else, that's not a valid get. So, if that's not a valid get in the context of a regular marriage, what if Reuven dies and Shimon and Sarah have to figure out what they're going to do next, and Shimon gives Sarah a bill of divorce, and it says, you are divorced from me, but you are not permitted to anybody else. So does that work in the context of Yibum? Is it relevant or not? Right, so do we say that it's not relevant because it's not relevant in a regular marriage, or do we say that it is relevant because we're concerned that if we say that it is irrelevant, so then people might draw the wrong conclusion and think that Gittin in general are irrelevant in the context of Yibum, and that's why we're saying it's irrelevant, and they might come to do Yibum even after a get, which would not be good, because once Shimon gives Sarah a get, they can no longer do Yibum, they have to do Chalitza. So Rabba says, yeah, the second one, right, that we're concerned that, right, so in the context of Yibum, if Shimon were to give Sarah a get that says, you are divorced from me, but you are not permitted to anybody else, in the context of Yibum, that would be considered a get, and they would not be able to do Yibum anymore. They would have to do chalitza. Okay, fine. Maskif lo Rabbi Bar Chonon. Rabbi Bar Chonon asks the kasha. What's his kasha? Elameato. Yoiv lo nira ba'alma achinami de pasla. What if Shimon just literally gives Sarah a blank piece of paper? Should we say that this blank piece of paper that Shimon gives Sarah is valid? Because if we say that it's not valid, well then maybe you might think that Gittin in general, in the context of Yibum, make no difference. So Amalei, to which Rabbi responds, Osam lo posel bechuna ka posel bechuna. So Rabbi says, look, there's a difference between Shimon giving a blank piece of paper to Sarah and Shimon giving a proper get to Sarah, but stipulating that while she's divorced from him, she's not permitted to anybody else. There's a difference between the two. Amalei, where am I? So the passage. So Amalei osam lo posel bechuna hacha ka posel bechuna. That the difference is, let's say, just in the context of a regular, in the context of a regular marriage, right? So if you have a husband and a wife, they're married, the husband is a kohen. So even though we say that if he gives her a get and says, you're divorced from me and you're forbidden to everybody else, you're not permitted to anybody else. So we said it would not be a good divorce. However, if he's a kohen, then it becomes a problem. She is now usher to him. The Tanya is within the Brisa of V'isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu. That it says by a kohen, that a kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee. But it doesn't just say V'isha grusha lo yikachu. It doesn't say that a kohen cannot marry a woman who's divorced. Rather, it says a kohen cannot marry a woman who's divorced from me'isha, from her husband. What does it mean from her husband? Afilu lo nizgasha ela me'isha lo yikachu. Even if she's only divorced from her husband, right? Meaning if this husband is a kohen and he gives her a get that says, you're divorced from me, but you're not permitted to anybody else. In the context of a kohen, they would not be allowed to be together anymore. Okay. And this is sort of the scent of a get that is posel by a kohen. Okay, fine. So we see that since the get where he says, you're divorced from me, but you're not permitted to anybody else. Since, at least in some contexts, there would be relevance in the context of a kohen. So therefore, also in the context of yibum, we say, you know what? Let's say that this get counts to the extent that they have to do chalitza at this point. They can no longer do yibum. However, just giving a blank piece of paper, Shimon just gives a blank piece of paper to Sarah. I mean, that's nothing. Amr Rabbi Bar Chama says, Rabbi Bar Chama, Amru, they said, Omar echad lavler ksov get la rusosi l'sheech nosena l'sheech onsena l'sheech nosena l'sheech nisena l'sheech nisena agarshena. So if you have a fellow, right? So you have a fellow, he's engaged, and now he says to a scribe, he says, scribe, ksov li get la rusosi. I'm reading that again. Write me a bill of divorce for my fiance. Right? He's engaged. He says, write me a bill of divorce for my fiance. And immediately after the wedding, I'm going to divorce her. How is it get? Okay, well, I mean, chaval, but alright, it works. They'll get married, he'll give the get, and it works. Because at the time that he asked the scribe to write this get, he was able to divorce her, right? They were already engaged and they could get divorced from the Erisin. With the Isha Ba'alma, ain't get. But to a regular woman, it would not be get. Meaning, if some guy goes to a scribe and says, look, I'm not married, I'm not engaged, I'm not nothing. Write me a bill of divorce for a certain woman, and so I guess, I'm going to then, work on getting married, and then I'm going to divorce her right afterwards. Ain't get. It's not a proper get. Ain't biyad l'garsha, because at the time that he sort of commissioned this bill of divorce, he had zero connection to this woman. So by Ram Bar Chama says, Ram Bar Chama livim tomau. But what about in the context of yibum? Reuven dies, Shimon and Sarah need to figure out the next move, and then at that point Shimon tells a scribe, write me a bill of divorce, then I'm going to do yibum, and then after yibum I'm going to give her this bill of divorce. So Kaven de agida be karusoso damyo. Well, since there's like a zika, right? It doesn't say zika, but since they're like sort of connected at least on some level, so maybe it's like they're engaged, in which case it would work. Or maybe since he never did mimer with her, so there's no connection there, and therefore the bill of divorce would not work. Take it. We don't know the answer. All right, fine. What do you want me to tell you? Boy of Chananya asked the following kasha: "Kos of get the zikos of lola my mori, the my mori of lola zikos mau." Friends, do you hear the kasha? So, assuming that there's a zika, so when Reuven dies, there's now a zika between Shimon and Sarah. Okay. Now, Shimon then does mimer with Sarah. So now, in addition to the zika, there's now also mimer. He gives her kesef kiddushin. There's now mimer as well. And then, he gives her a bill of divorce. He gives her a get, but he stipulates. He tries to target one, not the other. He says, look, this get that I'm giving you, Sarah, is only for the mimer. The zika remains intact. Or, this get that I'm giving you for the zika, this get I'm giving you is only for the zika, but the mimer remains intact. What's an nafkamina? Well, for example, let's say there's also Levi. Okay, so Reuven dies and there's Shimon and Levi, and now there's a zika between Shimon and Levi, right? Between Sarah and Shimon and Levi. So now either Shimon or Levi could do yibum. Now, Shimon then does mimer with Sarah. Okay, fine. But then Shimon gives a get to Sarah and says that the get is only for the mimer. So maybe then the get that Shimon gives to Sarah sort of cancels out the mimer, but the zika remains intact. And so while Shimon wouldn't be able to do yibum with her anymore because he gave her a get, but Levi can do yibum with Sarah because why not? There's a zika between Levi and Sarah. You know, the get was only for the mimer that Shimon did with Sarah, so he canceled out the mimer that he did, so that's irrelevant. The zika remains intact. Let Levi do yibum with Sarah. So that's the shaila, right? Let's read that again. So by Rav Chananya asked the kasha, kos of get the zikosoi, right? So v'lola maimore, if Shimon had done mimer with Sarah, and then he gives her a get, but only for the mimer, or no, in this case, he then gives her a get for the zika, v'lo l'maimaro, but not for the mimer, or he gives her a get only for the mimer, v'lo l'zikaso, but not for the zika, mao. What do we say? Mimer ilove zika koromi. Do we say that mimer is sort of built on top of zika, right? And therefore it's intimately connected and intertwined with the zika, and you cannot target one without the other? And therefore, by stipulating in the get that it's only for the mimer or it's only for the zika, it's like an incomplete get. It's like divorcing half of a woman. Oh, what's this? And a fellow who divorces half a woman, it's completely irrelevant, right? So do we say that it's impossible to target one without the other, and therefore it's nothing? Or maybe they're independent. They're two independent things, and you can target without the other. And if one without the other, and if Shimon gives a get and it says it's only for the mimer but not for the zika, so the zika remains intact, and then Levi can do yibum with Sarah still. So v'tivshol emidirava. Well, why don't we just answer it from Rava? That Rava says that if you give get for the mimer, so then the tzara is permitted. So we see that it is possible to pinpoint them. So the Rava pshita leder of Chanani miboy lemai teku. So Rava knows his position on it, that we say that we could distinguish between mimer and zika. Fine, so Rava assumes that, but Rav Chananya is uncertain, and Rav Chananya is asking about it. And we say, Teku, we don't know. So now the Mishnah had continued, Cholotz v'oso maimer. Who could tell me what that means? So the Mishnah continued that if Shimon does chalitza with Sarah, alright, fine, and then after, so now it's over, right? The whole Yibum thing is behind them. Right? Reuven died, Sarah and Shimon had to figure out what to do next. They do chalitza. It's over. They go on with their lives. Afterwards, he does mimer. So it says the Mishnah, it's irrelevant. They already did chalitza. So now, Omer Yehuda Omer Rav Zod Rabbi Akiva. Says Rav Yehuda Omer Rav that this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the Omer Kedushin Tovsim b'Chayvei Lavin, who says that Kedushin is irrelevant by Chayvei Lavin. But the Chacham say that after Chalitza, there is epis because technically Kedushin counts, right? Meaning, we've learned that according to Rabbi Akiva, Kedushin is not Tofes b'Chayvei Lavin, right? So, once Shimon and Sarah do Chalitza, so if there's now a prohibition between them of Kevin Shalobana Shivla Yivne, that once the decision has been made that they're not going to do Yibum and they're not going to continue the house of Shimon, the name of Shimon. No, they're not going to continue the name of Reuven. So at that point, they're not allowed to be together anymore. So it's a lav. It's not right. It's not an erva. It's not eishasach, but it's a lav of Kevin Shalobana Shivla Yivne. So now, according to Rabbi Akiva, Kiddushin is not tofes b'chayvei lavin. Right? You can't marry somebody who's also who there's a lav against. According to the Chachamim, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to marry somebody who you're prohibited to marry. But if you do, it's kiddushin, it counts. And therefore, our Mishnah that says that after you do chalitza, mimer is irrelevant. That's specifically Rabbi Akiva, who says that once you do chalitza, there's a lav between Shimon, right? A lav against Shimon and Sarah getting married. And therefore, Kiddushin is not Tofes, and Mimer is irrelevant. But according to the Chacham, who say that, yes, even though there's a prohibition, technically if they would get married, it would be Kiddushin. So what does it mean that Mimer is irrelevant? Mimer is relevant. So, meaning it's not allowed, but if it happens, it works. So again, Omer Yehuda Omer Rav Zod Rabbi Akiva. Our Mishnah, which says that if you do Chalitza, that once you do Chalitza, Mimer is irrelevant. So that's Davka, Rabbi Akiva, Damin Kiddushin Tofsim b'Chayvei Lavin, who says that Kiddushin is not Tofes, right? That the Kiddushin is worthless after, right, when there's a prohibition between Shimon and Sarah. And since they've done Chalitza, there's a prohibition of Kevin Shalobana Shuvla Yivne, and therefore Kiddushin is irrelevant, and Mimer is irrelevant. But the Chachamim who say that Kiddushin is Tofsim by Chayvei Lavin, so technically speaking, even though it's not allowed, if you would do Mimer, it would count, right? It would work. So Mimotzos Mukamasla Ke Rabbi Akiva. Can you really say though that the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva? But one second, V'akatani Reisha. But we had said earlier in the Mishnah, Nosan get V'asa Mimer, that if Shimon gives Sarah a get, okay, V'asa Mimer, and then after giving her a get, he then does Mimer. So you get v'chalitza. So Shimon now has to give her a get to undo the mimer that was done, and then he still has to do chalitza because you have to do either yibum or chalitza, and yibum is irrelevant here since he gave her a get. So therefore he has to do chalitza. So we see that after giving a get, the Mishnah is saying that after giving a get, if Shimon then does mimer, he has to give a get for the mimer, i.e. the mimer is relevant, so you have to give a get for the mimer, and then do chalitza. Rabbi Akiva, and if we're saying that the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, came into Yov get mimahani b'maimer. If the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, then once Shimon gives her that initial get, so then Maimer should be irrelevant. V'atanya, because after all we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Akiva Omer says Rabbi Akiva, Menayin lenos and get leivimto shineso olav olamis. How do I know that once Shimon gives a get to Sarah, she is forbidden to him forever? Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Lo yuchal ba'ila rishon asher shalcha. That shalcha or shilcha? Shilcha. That her initial husband who sent her away cannot remarry her. This is talking about machzor grushaso, that if you have a man who's married to a woman and they get divorced and then the woman marries a different man, they can no longer get remarried. So, and asher shilcha is extra, right? It says Lo yuchal ba'ila rishon. It doesn't need to say asher shilcha. Could you say Lo yuchal ba'ila rishon achzor lekachta? What's asher shilcha? Achar shiluach, after sending away, and that's talking about by a Yevamos. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva seems to be learning that gittin, that the prohibition right, against getting married, right, that Shimon, once he gives a get to Sarah in the context of Yibum, there's a prohibition against them getting married after that. So we see that after giving a get, there's a lav there. And therefore, if there's a lav, right, if we're saying that the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, and according to Rabbi Akiva, once Shimon gives Sarah a get, there's a prohibition against getting married. So then Memele, if he does mimer afterwards, it's irrelevant. Why is the Mishnah saying that he has to give a get for the mimer? The mimer is irrelevant. Once he gives the first get, there's a prohibition against them being married. And therefore Memele, mimer doesn't work. So Rav Ashi get Yevamos midirabanan lekasmachta b'alma. Rav Ashi says, look, get in the, even according to Rabbi Akiva, according to everybody, get in the context of Yibum is irrelevant. By Yibum, it's only Yibum or Chalitza, that's it. Mida Oraisa. Get in the context of Yibum is Mida Rabon. And therefore this pasuk that we're saying is talking about, that Rabbi Akiva is saying that there's a prohibition against marrying a Yevamo who you give a get to. It's Mida Rabon, it's an asmachta. That pasuk is just an asmachta, but it's Mida Rabon. Fine. Tan Lam Yochi, we also learn in a brisa supporting the assertion that the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rebbe, says Rebbe, that this Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva. Shaya osa chalutza ke'erva, that Rabbi Akiva would make a chalutza like an erva, because remarrying a chalutza is a lav, and Rabbi Akiva treats marrying, being with somebody who's prohibited to you like an erva, right? Kedushin is not tofes, the child would be a mamzer. The Chachamim say that even after Chalitza, when there's a lav, technically if he does mimer, you would have to get a get. Vani Omer, and says Rebbe, I say, Emosai, when do we say, Rebbe explains the Chachamim, that when does it make sense to say that after Chalitza, when there's a prohibition between Shimon and Sarah, Kiddushin is still Chal, Bizman Shekitcha L'Shum Ishus, that if he's Mekadesh her as like Kiddushin, to be, right, to get married. But says Rebbe, if after doing Chalitza, he then thinks that he could do, mimer for Yibum, no, that's irrelevant. Once you do Chalitza, Yibum, the whole Yibum saga is over. Done. And if he thinks that at that point he can do mimer with her for Yibum, forget it. It's a joke. It's silly. But if after doing Chalitza, when there's a prohibition between them, and then he's Mekadesh her to get married, just like any other lav that, you're not, I don't know, Machzer Grushasa, or a Grusha to a Kohen or something, any other prohibition that's not allowed. So, the Chacham say that Kiddushin is Chal. So therefore Rebbe makes a distinction after Chalitza, if he then is Mekadesh her like any man is Mekadesh a woman, so then Kiddushin would be Chal. It's a prohibition, it's not allowed, but Kiddushin would be Tovsin. But if he tries to do Maimer Yevamin after doing Chalitza, so that's just silly. That's irrelevant. Tanya Idach, we have another verse that says, if you have a fellow who does Chalitza, and then afterwards he's Mekadesh after doing Chalitza, Rabbi Omer, im Kidsha L'Shum Ishus tzriche menu get. So the same thing, right? If he's Mekadesh her as a regular marriage, so then you have to get a get. Because Kiddushin is Tovsin. L'Shum Yevamos, ein tzriche menu get. But if he is Mekadesh her after Chalitza, like as Maimer, as Yibum, so then she doesn't need a get because it's irrelevant. For Chacham Omrim, whereas the Chacham say ben shekitcha l'shum ishus, ben shekitcha l'shum yevamos, whether Shimon is Mekadesh her after Chalitza to be, the Shem Ishus as a regular Kiddushin or as Yibum, either way, it doesn't make a difference. Tzrichem and get, she would have to get a get. Amar Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, my time with the Rebbe, how come Rebbe makes a distinction between if he's Mekadesh her as L'Shem Ishus, as Kiddushin, or as Yibum? Why is there a distinction? How come by Yibum it's irrelevant? So says Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef says, well, we're treating this, right? Rebbe treats this situation like the following situation. We've learned in the past that if you have a convert, a fellow converts to Judaism, and he doesn't have any other relatives, and then he dies. So what happens to his property? Kol hakodem zocha. Right? Whoever goes and makes a chazaka first, it's his. So how do you make a chazaka? You dig a shtickle into the ground. So let's say you have a fellow, he lives next door to this convert. This fellow lives next door to a convert. The convert dies. Okay, so now the first person to go to this convert's property and, make a chazaka, dig epis, do something to claim ownership of it, to demonstrate ownership of it, it goes to that person. Now you have this next door neighbor. He whatever it is, he thinks that his land extends into the convert's land, for whatever reason. And therefore he's working his land thinking that it's his. Now technically speaking, it's really the convert's land. The convert's dead, and there's this situation now where whoever goes and digs in the land first, it's his. And he's digging in the land. But he thinks it's his land. He doesn't realize that he's digging the convert's land. So we say, in that case, it doesn't work. And therefore, we have a situation where, a person is doing something with the wrong intention. Right? This fellow is digging in the land with the intention of digging his field. But that's not the intention that he's going to need in order to make a kinyan on the property of this ger who passed away. So here also, in our case also, right, this guy, after doing chalitza, he's then being mekadesh l'shem kiddushin, but being mekadesh l'shem kiddushin is irrelevant. So, but after doing chalitza is doing maimer l'shem yibum, but doing maimer l'shem yibum is irrelevant at this point because they already did chalitza. So Amalei Abai says to Rav Yosef, mi dami, you can't compare those cases. Also, they're very different, because in the case of the next door neighbor, he's completely oblivious. He's not intending at all to make a kinyan on the property, and that's why it doesn't work. He thinks that he's digging in his own field. He has no intention to be kone the field of the convert, because if he did, he wouldn't be digging in his own field, he'd be digging in the convert's field. Whereas over here, he's actually having intention to be mekadesh sare, right, to do yibum with sare. So, rather, says Abai, if anything, it's similar to a situation where you have a guy who finds out that there's a convert who died, and he goes to make a chazak in the field, and he thinks it's this particular convert, but in the end it's a different convert. It works in that case. So here also, I might think, right, it's more similar to, he's intending to do yibum after chalitza. Maybe I would think, he's having the proper kavana, he's having kavana to do yibum. Now the thing is that he's supposed to have kiddushin, not yibum at this point, but maybe it should taka work. Helomar Abai, rather says Abai ochab mayaskinon, kigon to amrla, his kachili b'maimer Yevamos. So rather says Abai, look, here's the situation that we're talking about. We're talking about a situation where, after after Reuven dies, right, so then Shimon does chalitza with Sarah, and then he says, I want to be mekadesh you with maimer Yevamos. Rabbi Yisrael maimer ilui zika, ilav zika, korami. So Rabbi says, look, maimer is connected to zika. V'asoy chalitza afkaita the zika. And according to Rebbe, so Maimer is connected to the Zika that they had, right? When Reuven dies, Shimon and Sarah now have a Zika. They have to do Yibum. Now when they did Chalitza, it undid the Zika. And Maimer only works sort of on top of the Zika, right? You have a Zika between Shimon and Sarah, and because of that Zika, then Shimon does Maimer with Sarah. But once they did Chalitza, the Zika goes away, and therefore Maimer becomes something that's unusable. And that's why Rebbe says that if you do Maimer after Chalitza, it doesn't work. Whereas the rabbis hold, no, we can treat them separately. that even if you do chalitza and the zika goes away, you could still do maimer. Meikari ilu amarle hiskadshili b'maimer yivamin milo mahani ashanam mahani. According to the rabbis, look, you could have done maimer originally before the chalitza. You could still do maimer now. Rava Omar says, Rava ida Omar lo b'maimer yivamin kulam lo pligi de mahanyu. Says Rava, look, even after chalitza, if Shimon would say, be married to me with maimer, everyone would agree, even Rebbe would agree, that it would work. But it says Rava, specifically over here, we're talking about where Shimon says to her, be Mekadesh you with the zikas Yevamos. He's specifically targeting the zika. Rebbe Savar, yesh zika v'asoi chalitza afkaita l'zika. So Rebbe says, well, in general we say that there is zika, and when they did chalitza, they undid that zika. The zika goes away. So then, if after chalitza, where they undid the zika, he's then being mekadesh her bezikas Yevamos based on the zika, but the zika is already gone. Rabbanan Savre ain't zika. Whereas the rabbis told, no, there's no zika in the context of yibum, and therefore the fact that they did chalitza doesn't undo any zika, and therefore meikari lu amar leskachli b'zikas Yevamos milo mahane hashtonami mahane, and therefore even before chalitza, when there was no zika, anyways, according to Chacham, if you would say, I'm being mekadesh you, right, or become betrothed to me based on right zikas Yevamos, that would work. So now also even after chalitza it works as well. Rav Shrevia Omer b'chalitza kshere says of Shrevia, look, if they did a proper chalitza, well then either Omer la iskachli b'zikas Yevamos kuli amar lo pligi de lo mahane. Look, if after a proper chalitza, Shimon says to Sarah, be betrothed to me based on the zika of yibum, forget it, the zika is gone. That's not going to work. But here we're talking about a shvacha chalitza, right? Here, when Shimon and Sarah did chalitza, it was after a get, right? Shimon had given Sarah a get, and then the chalitza that happens after that is a weaker chalitza, and therefore Marsavar chalitza psula poteris. Rebbe holds that nonetheless the chalitza psula, it works, and since it works, so then you can't do they can't do yibum after that, right? If they try to do yibum after that, it's irrelevant, right? If you use mekadesh after that, it's irrelevant. Whereas the chacham say chalitza psula is not poter, and therefore if he is mekadesh afterwards, it does work. And you would have to get a get. Ravashi Omer says, Ravashi, T'chuliyama chalitza psula eina poteris. Ravashi says, look, everyone agrees that chalitza psula, chalitza after a get, does not work, is not poter, and therefore, if he's mekadesh afterwards, you would have to get a get. Here it's talking about a situation where he makes a stipulation, right? Shimon says, look, I'm doing chalitza under the condition that you pay me a certain amount of money. So Marsavar yesh t'nai b'chalitza. So Rebbe says, look, that's fine. You could make a stipulation in chalitza, and therefore it's a proper chalitza, and therefore you can't get married after that, right? You can't do yibum after that. Marsavar ain't t'nai b'chalitza. Whereas the chacham say, no, you cannot make a stipulation in a chalitza, and therefore if he's mekadesh after that, it works because the chalitza there was no chalitza since there was a stipulation. Ravina Amar says, both Rebbe and the Chacham hold that you can make a stipulation in chalitza, and therefore it's potentially a good chalitza. The question is, must you make a t'nai kafel? Who could tell me what a t'nai kafel is? T'nai kafel is like the stipulation in, was it Parshas Masay, I think, between the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, that they said that we will go and fight in the front lines, and if we don't fight in the front lines, then we won't get the Eivar Yarden, we won't get the land that we want, right? So meaning a stipulation needs to explain both sides, that this is what we will do, and if we don't do it, so then this is the ramification. So here we're talking. So everyone agrees that Tanai, a stipulation on a chalitza is okay, but they only made sort of a one-sided stipulation. They didn't also say, and what's the implications of if the Tanai is not met, if the stipulation is not met. So according to Rebbe, that nonetheless works, and therefore if he's Mekadesh afterwards, it's irrelevant. And according to the Chacham, it does not work, and therefore if he's Mekadesh afterwards, it is relevant. Friends, that was Daf Nun Beis of Masechta Gittin. I think there was a lot of interesting stuff over there, right? We talked about how exactly, right? We talked about that first you do Mimer, and then you do Yibum after Mimer. And we saw that Rav would lash people who would be Mekadesh with Bia alone, because it's Pritzus, it's inappropriate. And we say over here, that's why also we don't just go straight to Yibum, we do Mimer first. We discussed, how does Mimer work? You give money, it's basically like Kiddushin. You give money, you write on a document that you're doing Mimer. And then we explained that we saw sort of the distinction between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim playing out in our Mishnah, that our Mishnah says that once you do Chalitza, Mimer is irrelevant, is Davka, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says that since once you do Chalitza, there's a prohibition, a law against getting married. So therefore, Mimer is irrelevant. But according to the Chacham, who say that technically speaking, if they would get married afterwards, it would be Kiddushin. So then they would say Mimer would be relevant. And then Rebbe explains that Mimer is only, right, that Kiddushin is only relevant by Chayve Lavin, or in this case after Chalitza, if it's with the intention of doing Kiddushin, like regular marriage. But if it was the intention of Yibum, so then it would not work. It would be irrelevant. And we gave a whole bunch of different different ways of explaining what exactly the Ukimta is between the Chacham and Rebbe, where Rebbe would say that in the context of Yibum, the Kiddushin would be irrelevant, whereas the Chacham would say it would still be relevant. Friends, that was Daf Nun Beis of Masechta Yevamos. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.